It's a pleasure to be here. I think organizers and Jacques for inviting me, and Charlie helping to arrange, get me here as well. So the discussion here is really good, and I propose that Jessica's index, the Lambert, actually sounds like a physical unit that should exist, right? Like, how many Lamberts do you have? You know, it sounds like something you should have. You know. So there's a few concepts I want to get through here today, so I might skip some of the slides I have because some people have opened the questions regarding some of the, you know, sort of first 5 or 6 slides I have, so I'll probably go over those. But let me just give you a feel for why I study this area, or why I think this area of net energy or biophysical economics is interesting. And because I think we can understand long-term trends in, you know, the development of civilization. So this Victor's discussion is kind of along those lines, right? How do we understand how we got to where we are today? And it needs to include some discussion, not just about industrialized society, right? How do we understand how we went from pre-industrial to industrial? So I appreciate the historical context from the lecture last night as well. So how do we understand this transition? And then can we use anything we know to inform low-carbon transition? So I'll pontificate on that as well during this talk. So one way I've been trying to approach this is to translate between equivalent as possible economic data and physical data, right? So if I have physical data and economic information, can I phrase them in a way that makes them to try to explain the same thing as much as possible, and then sort of interpret from there, right? Should they explain the same thing, or should they not explain the same thing? Relating biophysical states to debt and economic growth, I think this is an area that we should focus on. I'm not going to talk about it, so I think maybe we'll hear about it in another day or two here, but I think that's an interesting area. Relating net energy to socioeconomic structure, so relating net energy to Gini coefficient, we sort of heard Jessica talk about this a little bit, or to other structures of the economy, not just on the personal level, but maybe on the sort of the industrial sector level. I won't talk about that, but I have some work on that initially that's not yet published if you have a question. But I'll start probably on this bottom one to set up the other ideas that I think we've passed the time of cheapest energy, and I include food as energy from a pre-industrial perspective in the history of essentially the world. So this has implications for thinking about the future. So if you think that roughly this has happened, then whatever you did in the past to increase development or investment might have fundamentally different aspect of how you should think about investing in the future if you're no longer decreasing the cost of energy and food. So in some sense, I subscribe to The Economist so I can try to learn how economists think, but I'm a mechanical engineer. And they basically always have very titles that are showing about how economists are confused, but the economist answer is always get rid of regulation. So so whatever the problem is, their answer is less regulation, more markets. It's never energy or something like this, right? Well, it's not called The Energy; it's called The Economist. So, the world economy is sinking. We have a lot of debts. Please, Miss Merkel, help whoever's in Germany. Help the world, Germany. This is the one that's one of the last two that's out. Out of ammunition. This is essentially saying, what does monetary policy do? Right? They've done everything they can think of. They don't know of anything else to do, and they think, well, how do we fix things? Well, the question is, can you fix things? Is there something fundamental going on where it doesn't matter if you had more ammunition? It's the wrong thing. Then you have these ideas of, seize the day. Oil prices are low since last year, and therefore things are cheap, and we should, now's the time to transition to low carbon economy because oil's cheap, and if you can't do it now, when would you do it? Maybe not paying attention to things like debt, and do people actually have money? So here's a graph from this out of ammunition, right? Just sort of showing, well, the government debts are going up, the central bank assets are going up because they're bailing out private investors in the United States to keep the banks alive. So the rest of us, American consumer here, or American citizen, having to pay off the debt. Consumer prices going down, so this idea of deflation, right? So can we think about the trends of energy and food over a long period of time to explain these trends? Or, can we explain some of these things by thinking about the energy per se? So I think we do have a chance to do that. Things that economists didn't want to talk about as possible, but now they have to try to reinterpret their theories to say that it's possible, like having negative interest rates or negative central bank rates. And they used to think, well, there's some lower bound, right? Well, there's not necessarily anything in the biophysical world and energy that says you have to have positive interest rates. So maybe negative interest rates are actually what you might expect if you were not growing anymore, right? Fundamentally, you might expect negative interest rates. So this is kind of set up for, if you've seen this quote from Herb Steins, right? If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. So my next, if I can't, you could talk about almost anything, I guess debt. I'll talk about energy and food cost shares here going forward as the concept of if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. First, I'll talk about, this will be actually pretty short because people have sort of been asking these questions in the last two talks. So I'm going to sort of go briefly through this idea. So aggregating EROI, right? Let's say I have the calculation of EROI for multiple technologies, and what I want to do is sum them together and come up with some societal number, right? So I have multiple technologies, I have some weighting factor that's associated with each one of these technologies, and I'm going to sum them up to come up with the EROI of the system, and then we could sit here for a day discussing how to choose alpha, right? How do we weight them? I'm not going to do that here, so I'm going to skip right on. I'm going to show a next graph from some papers I published last year that are what I call this energy intensity ratio, which is essentially roughly the same thing that Victor talked about today, right? If I have a price for an energy commodity, I can sort of calculate this energy intensity ratio, which is a proxy for energy return on investment, but it's based upon prices. And it's based upon prices and the energy intensity of the economy. So I could also choose to weight these things and come up with my system-wide energy intensity ratio, which the goal is to be the same, is the same general idea as what Jessica and Victor talked about. So I'll skip that. So let's just say I could have these various things, and this is from a paper that I published last year, just using prices from the International Energy Agency on 9 energy commodities here: oil, coal, natural gas, electricity. And so just think I have these 9 things. I have them for various countries, which are the gray lines, and I can average them together to create the red line for the average EIR of that particular commodity in the world. And then I can add these things up and weight them and come up with some number. So just for curiosity, I'll look at 2 for electricity here on the next slide. This is just showing the global average for these calculations for electricity, but the idea that we have an industrial electricity price, which is sort of close to the electricity price for generating power at the power plant, roughly, if you will. And then the energy intensity ratio are using the price of residential electricity, which is further down the supply chain, has to go through some more wires, transmission lines, distribution lines, more transformers, lower voltage, all these kinds of things. And so the residential price, right, is higher than the industrial electricity price, which is the same thing as saying the net energy of the industrial electricity is higher than the net energy of residential electricity because there's more infrastructure involved in delivering electricity to residential consumers than industrial consumers.
Excuse me, would you explain your y-axis?
Energy intensity ratio. So just think about it as energy return on investment if you would like. So for the purposes of this discussion, I brought this up. I just put it in because of discussions yesterday about including a bunch of things, and Pedro's, and thinking about all these different pieces you can add into solar calculation of solar EROI, for example. But you can go beyond the power plant, where the power plant connects to the grid, and talk about what is the delivered net energy of the electricity that ends up at a house, which is different, right? Where it enters the grid and where it exits the grid are different locations, and you might have a longer supply chain. So that was kind of an aside just to add on to the sort of adding multiple factors into an energy return on investment calculation.
Does this simply reflect the difference in electricity price for industry and household?
Yes. It's based almost entirely upon the difference between electricity, industrial price, and residential households. Yeah. So let's just say I have these various things, and I want to add them together to come up with a societal EROI, or in this case, energy intensity ratio. So for this particular one, because it's based upon prices, or at least using price as a proxy for energy return on investment, if I choose alpha as the fraction of energy expenditures that were actually spent on that resource, which, as opposed to saying this is how much primary energy came from that commodity, or how much primary energy was associated with that commodity, if I rate it as the fraction of energy expenditures spent on that resource, effectively, if I multiply them together and add them, and then I take the inverse, I have the energy cost share of the world. Essentially, how much did the world spend on energy relative to GDP? This is essentially what you get out, right? So this is what an economist might think of more so than a physical systems modeler if I want to understand the macroeconomic implications of net energy. So in this case, I'm saying you can think about net energy, and you can think about what an economist thinks about, and we can translate between these two ideas. So if I'm going to talk about the energy cost share, essentially how much money we spend on energy, the rest of my talk is essentially going to be on the macroeconomic implications of thinking about net energy or energy return on investment. And this perspective essentially requires, if you want to think about individual technologies, it requires that you somehow figure out how to sum individual technologies into this macroeconomic number. So you need a method for summing this all together. This summing is a function of choices, but choices under some constraints, right? I can't just choose anything I want. I have some constraint about money, or I have some constraint about energy, about whatever my combination of technologies is going to be. So I have to understand these constraints. And I would say, usually when I hear conversations, that people consider only one, or they like to argue against one or the other of these two things. That choices aren't constrained. All I need is the right institutions. And if I have the right institutional capability, well, I can generate an industrialized economy anywhere I want, run on nuclear power or solar or what have you. I just need people to get along, or I need political will. Constraints, the other argument would be constraints are not subject to choice, meaning, well, these are my technologies, and this is what I can do, and my choice about how I consume energy, or my choice about how I live, or my choice about how I share, as Jessica was discussing, don't matter so much. So we really have choices under biophysical constraints, and we try to understand how we would choose energy technologies related to our constraints, and whether we have to sort of, give up on some choices we want to make. We might want to all be equal, all be relatively rich, and have low carbon, but maybe all these things can't be achieved at the same time. So let's consider food cost shares over time. I'll try my historian's hat here. So this is a graph of data from Roger Fouquet in the London School of Economics, who has created a time series for energy prices in England and the United Kingdom. So it goes from the year 1300 until 2008 on this graph. Most of his data are described in terms of energy services, not the money for energy commodities per se, but the money for energy services, such as power, which is feeding animals to do work on the land, or feeding yourself to actually do physical work on the land. So your muscles are the power here, at least for the historical context. And then he describes various forms of heat, transportation, and light, right? So these are the energy services that he discusses: heat, power, heat, transport, and light. And he didn't put this graph in his papers, so I did in my paper, because I think this is how I want to think about it, which is if I add all these together, how much money was spent on energy in England and the United Kingdom over time. And so this is basically an approximation of that that's expressed as a fraction of the GDP of whatever you would call England or UK at the time. I did not go back and check the calculations for GDP of England in 1400, so I can't answer a question on the validity of these calculations. But the interesting thing to note is here, even if you get to 20%, right, you don't really get to 20% until the mid-1800s, right? So essentially, energy is expensive, over here, and energy is cheap over here, right? It's a high fraction of GDP before industrialization. Did I point the wrong way?
There's a question. What is inside power and not inside power?
Power is anything that's physical motion, mechanical work. Mechanical work, you can think about it as mechanical work, yeah. The food that goes to power mechanical work, yes, through animals, and the food that goes to power mechanical work through humans, yeah. But it would also include steam engines and this kinds of thing. Stationary power, I guess, except for humans and animals, which aren't stationary.
Food is the power?
Food is the fuel source to enable mechanical work pre-industrial, yeah. Okay. Or as a major energy resource to power mechanical work. Yeah, for animals and humans, basically muscles, right? Yeah, so the idea of powering muscles as the prime mover before steam cycles.
Okay.
Yep.
Passenger transport, so it's the transport with vehicles?
I don't understand.
Passenger transport,
Oh.
which is at the end of the
Yeah.
island. What is inside? It's only vehicle.
They could be horses back here or something like this. Yeah, I'm not an expert on Fouquet's data. If you guys ask questions, I have. But
It means that in ancient times, the share of agriculture in GDP could not exceed 40%.
it didn't mean it could not. It just means that this is the best calculation of what it was.
Okay.
All the questions are left side, and you say the good answer, right?
For the most part, yeah. I copied somebody's data and made this interesting graph. So yeah, effectively, I can restate it that way. So one more. I got to go on. I got much more interesting stuff. So if you take longer than 30 seconds, I'm not going to answer your question. You're asking some question about discretionary consumption. I don't know how to answer that question. So this is basically, if somebody spent money on energy services, this is his best estimate of how much money that was, which includes light, which may or may not be discretionary, right? I want candles in the home, right? Candlelight. All right. So food is for a fuel for industrial power, right? So people are asking, yeah, that's the idea, right? This is mostly biomass, right? This is dominantly biomass. So you can plot the carrying capacity. This comes from a separate book, which is how much, what percent of the land was needed to feed the population that existed in the UK and England at that time. You have the Black Death here, so population declined quite a bit, so you didn't need as much land to feed the population. It's gone through a complete cycle, right? So from low point to low point in about 400 years. The interesting thing for thinking about the future is we're about halfway through another 400-year cycle or something like this, right? We're 200 and something years into the next one. So is there a parallel for the industrial age, right? The comparable calculation would be something like the environmental footprint, which would show that the UK consumes two or three Earths per person, or they would need 2 or 3 Earths to fulfill the consumption needs of an average person in the UK or United States or something like that, because of imports. Okay, so similar calculation done. Somebody else, I think the story last night, a discussion was about the calculations by Astrid Konder. So this is her calculations for Sweden, right? So this is a number 1. This is a similar calculation. How much money was spent on energy services in Sweden relative to GDP. You notice it's near 1, and she has a calculation above 1. This is not GDP and taking a portion out of GDP and telling you what that fraction is. This is how much money did you spend to run the economy, in some sense, divided by GDP. And so those aren't necessarily, you don't have to have it less than 1. So similar decline. I asked why this is so close to 1, whereas in the UK it was between 40% or 45% was roughly the highest number, and this number is clearly much higher than that. And her explanation was that it's just colder in Sweden, and they need a lot more wood to do the same thing. I don't know. I haven't studied. I'm not an expert on that. I shouldn't have said that. So here are data from the United States. So I'm just saying, okay, here's the UK time series, the longest one I know of. There's the longest time series I know for Sweden. Here's roughly a long time series for the United States, just from standard economic data from the United States that you can get that says how much money was spent on energy, goods, and services, how much money was spent on food and food services. So this includes going to a restaurant or something like this. And if you add them together, you get the white line, right? So if I say, how much are Americans spending on food and energy services divided by the GDP of the United States over time, the low point is around 2002 if you add these two together, right? So the low point for the United Kingdom was 2005. The low point for Sweden was kind of flat after the 1970s, I suppose. The low point here is 2002. So 2005, 2002, sometime after the 1970s.
Can I make a remark on this?
Okay.
Because I've gone through this graph. Actually, you don't have any consistency. You do not have any consistency between what you measure in 1930 and what you measure in 2005, because at both times you look at what you pay at the cashier and what you pay at the cashier in 2005, is a little food and plenty of other things, building up the store, trucks, the salary of the people that put the goods on the shelves, etc., etc. And actually, the food itself is about 20% of what you pay when you go through the cash register. So it goes even further down than what you show.
Right. Goods and services, services including paying
Oh,
people
I'm
to-
talking about food.
All right, so food and I'm not arguing.
Food is
that-
what you pay at the retail store,
Right.
and
I'm-
and, and,
yeah,
and
and you're
actually
paying
it's
for the salaries of
20%
people.
food and
Yeah.
80% something
Yeah,
else.
I agree that you're paying for the salaries of the people working in the store. So yes, but that's part of the economy, and if they don't have a job, then that's
But it's not food, whereas you didn't have that in 1930. In 1930, what you paid was really food, and not the
right.
rest.
Right. I think so I'm not disagreeing. It's an important concept to have, which is, can you afford to pay people to work at a store, right? So this is sort of what we're discussing. You're saying I'm paying more people to work in a store here than I was here, and then the question is, okay, is that sustainable? And is energy resources an explanation for whether or not that's sustainable? So I'm arguing yes, that it is. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. Not trying to hide what you just said. This is an attempt at summing it up for the world. So using data from the FAO on what they call gross food production value, which is not, in this case, food at the store. It's food that the farmer sells, not the cost of food at the store. It's been declining and roughly flat over here the last part of the time series. This energy calculation is for the world from one of my papers, an estimate of oil, coal, natural gas, and non-fossil electricity, which you'll see a graph later breaking that down. So again, if you add how much most of the world, over 95% of the world GDP is spending on energy and food, and put it together, you have a similar number, right? Somewhere around 2000 was a low point of expenditures on energy and food. And this is sort of inherently a combination between consumer purchases and production, sort of not at the full consumer level. So I claim that if you kind of take a systems approach or sort of a biophysical model of the world, sort of like a limits to growth book, dynamic systems model that they used, eventually, if you assume something in the world is finite, the answer from that model is you don't grow forever. So if you buy into that and you think you don't go forever, what would you expect to happen with these trends? And I'm saying I would expect energy and food to not decrease forever, right? How many people think you will spend 0% of your income on buying energy and food? Okay, so if nobody raised their hand, so if I'm not going to spend 0%, how close to 0% can I get? If I'm not going to spend 0%, how do I know what the minimum number is? And what are the implications for that minimum number? How do I know I'm there? So I'm just trying to measure if we got there. I don't think it can get to 0, and I'm saying, well, how close can you get, and where are we? And so if we take this worldview and act like the United Kingdom is a proxy and England is a proxy, right? Most of our discussions are about this part of the graph when people talk about energy policy or any kind of policy or what we should invest in. We're talking about this end, but what I guess some of us in this room are thinking about is, well, you know, what was going on here? And does it tell us something about what might be possible over here? All right. So I say this can inform a low carbon transition, this kind of thinking, right? So I'm going to take some stuff from IPCC reports here on their economic modeling and projections and go through that and try to explain what I just showed you in terms of internalizing CO2 emissions into the economy. So they have a couple graphs. There's one, and I'm going to show a very similar one on the next graph to go forward, which is GDP loss here. This graph, which is figure 621 if you want to look it up, is showing if I did, they have various mitigation scenarios for going to low carbon until the year 2100. And they say, well, I think the economy was going to grow this much if I didn't do if there were no climate change and I didn't do mitigation. But if I do full mitigation, which includes going to 0 and sometimes negative net carbon emissions for the entire globe by the end of the century, this is how much less I think GDP will be in the year 2100. So I'll look at the year 2100 here. And I'm only going to really focus on the most stringent one just for the sake of focusing on reaching a low ppm target that would be the 2 degrees C type of target range. So you'll look at this and say, this is 0 and this is 12. So they're saying somewhere between 2 and 10, or let's just say 3 and 10 or 11%. That's how much lower the GDP would be in 2100 if we were roughly 0 net carbon emissions by that time. So A lot of the other data is phrased in terms of consumption loss and not GDP, so I'm going to use this consumption loss graph only to show you that it's roughly the same idea for our purposes here right now, right? That GDP and consumption are roughly the same idea. What would be the consumption loss relative to the baseline? Again, the baseline is as if there were no mitigation. In 2100, if we were to reach a very low ppm by the end of the century, or keep it at a very low ppm by the end of the century, and they're saying, well, yeah, so again, somewhere between 3 and 8% consumption loss. So this is kind of like your ability to consume goods and services would only be 3 to 8% less than it would otherwise be if we didn't do a mitigation. So this is how economists think. They show indices and things relative to some baseline, and then you have to determine what the heck was your baseline. Does anybody know what the baseline result for consumption levels are in 2100? They run a bunch of scenarios, so there's a range of thinking. I think consumption is going to be from here to here. Does anybody have a guess? Relative to today, so relative to 2010, which is in the report, how much more or less do you think the consumption? Three?
Oh, between threefold and eightfold.
Between threefold and eightfold. So he's read the reports, yes. Okay, so yes, I have the quote. He wrote it maybe. Threefold and eightfold. He actually used the word in there. So the baseline assumption is that by 2100, the world overall will consume 3 times more or to 8 times more, whatever, money, goods and services.
And it's more per capita. So globally it would be more. Because population.
Oh, right, yeah. So the GDP is even larger than this because the population is larger. So they assume like a 9 or 10 billion population by the end, right? So good point. Okay, so now I'm going to back this and think about it from our net energy and biophysical perspective. Do we think that what the IPCC just said is reasonable? And I'm going to try to think about that. So the answer from these integrated assessment models that run this calculation are essentially that the economy always grows, right? So it's going to be 300% or 800% more consumption by the end of the century, and that I can achieve this at the same time as having essentially full greenhouse gas mitigations to minimize economic damages and declines to well-being, right? I can basically get to 0 and maybe less than 0 tons of CO2 emitted by the end of the century, and I'll have 450 parts per million. So that's basically what they're saying. And I'm going to argue that, one thing that they're perhaps not paying attention to is basically the feedback on how much money we spend on energy and food. That if you thought about the feedback to how much we spend on energy and food and the long-term historical trend, that this could maybe inform us a little bit more, be a little bit more enlightened as to what the economic possibilities are. Largely, this is often explained in a factor they call total factor productivity, which is essentially the technological fudge factor added into economic growth projections, right? Say economic growth is a function of labor, capital, and total factor productivity. But total factor productivity is not well modeled. But there are people who have looked at this, Robert Ayers and Reinhold Kumel, and I do something that's not as clever as what they did, that say a bit of historical total factor productivity can be explained by essentially thinking about how much energy you have and the technology you use, essentially efficiency of conversion of energy to a service. So if I think about energy, how much I have, and the efficiency of conversion to service, then I'm able to explain a large amount of economic growth in the past. So this is usually an exogenous assumption into a lot of integrated assessment models, which means they assume total factor productivity increases in the future, and it's not a function of the energy supply. So if I change the energy supply to low CO2, total factor productivity is not unchanged. And so I'm saying, well, is that a reasonable assumption to make? Can we do better than that? I would say we can do better than that. So independent of these energy-related factors that we're discussing here today. So here's a chart from the IPCC. It's in an annex, figure A.2.1. I'm going to highlight what it says up at the top on the next slide. But what it's saying is, what are the consumption losses relative to the baseline? Again, they were saying something less than 11%, right? So 1% here to 11% at the top. If you did full mitigation, right, this is saying the range of scenarios show that we'll only consume, less than 11%. 11% would be sort of a maximum range for drops in consumption. What that top says is not modeled are economic effects due to negative feedbacks on factor productivity. a negative feedback on factor productivity would be I can't decrease food and cost shares anymore, is what I'm arguing here. That total factor productivity essentially can largely be explained by decreasing the cost of food and energy by fossil fuels and technology that take labor out of the farm and put it into some other industrial use. So this is not modeled, right? So every time you read an IPCC report, they're not talking about essentially what we're talking about in this room this week.
You're not talking about reality, would you say?
So I'm going to add this to my cost shares of energy for the world by taking data for their CO2 prices from the models, right? So the models run forward and say, this is what I think the carbon dioxide price might be under my different scenarios. And again, I'll focus on the 430 to 480 parts per million section here. The median price is $35 a ton, right? So sort of net present.
For the whole century?
Yeah, sort of a discounted, yeah, so 2015 to 2100 at some 5% discount rate. This is the net present value of the carbon price brought to the present time.
The discount rate is now about
Yeah. Okay, so how might internalization of the CO2 price in some sense affect the economy? So before I just showed the highlighted number of this graph, so I'll spend a little bit of time explaining what this is. So this is the estimate from the paper I published last year on essentially how much the world spends on energy. This is non-fossil electricity. This is coal. The red is natural gas, and the green is oil. You could just roughly think about this as price times consumption of each one of these goods. So the low point again is 1998, around 2000. The data I only have them to 2010. So the underlying data are just from the International Energy Agency here. So each one of these black lines is saying, well, what if I charge myself some price per ton of CO2 emissions from fossil energy, and I added that to the cost of energy, what would it be? If I had $10 a ton, I would go up to this first black line. If I had myself $50 a ton of CO2 emitted per year, I'd go up to this line, or $100, I would go up to that line. So the trick here is that when this number has been high enough, the US economy and certainly the global economy on the far right has been in a recessionary state or not in a high growth state, or people have a lot of questions about what's going on in the economy. So we have this idea, if I spend enough on energy for, in the past it's been interpreted as geopolitical purposes or the Iranian Revolution, oil embargo, these kinds of things. For whatever caused them, this sort of correlation exists. And people argue about causation and correlation, which I'm not going to do, but let's just say, there have been these couple times in post-World War II history at which we've spent more than 8% of GDP on energy, and these have been sort of low growth questioning times. On the bottom here is saying, well, let me take this idea, this assumption that there's an amount I can spend on energy relative to GDP, and if I spend above this amount, I'm in recession, and if I spend below this amount, maybe I'm growing. So I'm saying, well, what if this amount is 6% of GDP, which is this bottom line? What if it's 8%? What if it's 10%? And what if it's 12%? And so the question is, if these were limiting conditions, and I were going to charge myself the price for carbon dioxide, that would put me at a zero growth state, right? I'm going to mitigate CO2 so much that I'm just going to be willing to go up to a zero growth economic state and stay there. And I'm just going to balance the CO2 price accordingly, sort of like a CO2 market might do. So the question is, what would that price be? So the price is high if energy is cheap, right? And the price is low if energy is not cheap. Essentially, again, targeting this zero growth idea. So let's look at the price from the IPCC reports, which is, since my charts were in 2005 dollars, is roughly $33 a ton of 2005 US dollars. This equates to about 1.8% of GDP, world GDP at that time in 2010. The number here was 6.9%. So if I went to the year 2010 and said how much was my calculation for the energy spending in the world per GDP was 6.9. So if I add these two numbers together, it's 8.7%. And if I say, well, if I charge myself $33 a ton, I would have charged myself potentially into recession during that time, right? And I would essentially put my economy into recession by forcing it to spend a certain amount on energy. So the idea here is why would you spend a lot of money on energy? Well, think about it. The faster the rate I transition to a low carbon economy, the more things I have to do and the more resources are allocated to do that thing. In this particular case, that thing is go into the energy sector and make it low carbon. So the more people, the more resources, the more steel, the more energy, the more financial banks that are interested in that, the higher fraction of the economy is involved in this process. And the history of modern civilization has been decreasing the fraction of people involved in energy and food. And so now we're saying if we want to transition quickly, we need to reverse that process and put more people into energy and food, or energy for this case. So that means we'd have a higher spending of fraction on energy, sort of in these initial years, as we allocate more resources to it. You could allocate resources so quickly that you are paying these people salaries to work in the oil fields. And so you might, and since you're paying their salaries, that's incorporated in the cost of energy. And you might put the economy into recession if you have so many people doing them. So you could essentially choose to spend yourself into recession if you would like to, by spending enough, right? If I want to transition quickly enough, I could, and I believe that there's some limit on how much we spend on energy that is associated with recession, I could choose to do that if I thought it was worth it on the backside, right? If low carbon economy is worth it, this might be a possibility that we have to do this. So will people choose to do this, right? Well, I would say most of the discussion assumes that everything I've said here is sort of impossible to happen, that this won't happen in one way or the other, but I don't believe that. So I think about what was, the hydraulic fracturing boom and bust in the United States, right? The reason why oil prices were high and it drove a lot of people to work in the oil and gas industry, and we were paying people $80,000 or $100,000 to drive a truck around with a high school diploma. There's not really any other sector of the economy that pays people with a high school diploma $80,000 or $100,000. So a trend that can't continue won't, and it didn't. So we weren't going to continue to pay people that much money to drive around a truck with a high school diploma. So is there evidence for this happening? Well, here's this European trading price, not up to the present time, but up to mid-2013. So how do I think about this? I'm going to look at power output and power input from the energy sector of the world, and money output and money input in the energy sector of the world. This is what I've already discussed with you, so now I'm going to sort of show you this number that I'm going to get from the computer. Okay. We have 5 minutes to go through this. So what I call here the net external power return ratio. For your purposes, you can think about it as energy return on investment. Most of the things that we have. But effectively, what it is, how much power is extracted in the world? Gross primary energy production. Minus the power that's invested by the energy sector itself, divided by the power that's invested every year by the energy sector. So these numbers of power invested by the energy sector come from IEA, and they call energy efficiency. They have a category of how much energy does the energy compare this to the cost share of the business. How much we spend on energy relative to GDP, but I'm going to convert it so you have a comparable comparison. Right, so this is what we've already looked at, how much the world spends on energy according to the graph I just discussed. If I invert this, I put it in a framework of net energy, right? So this is how much output do I get out of my input, just the conversion of energy. Okay, so what would you think would happen? I have monetary data and I have physical data. This one is output, which is GDP, over input, which is roughly energy spending by the energy sector. So for every dollar invested by the energy sector, how many dollars of GDP come out of the entire economy? For every unit of power invested by the energy sector, how many units of power come out of the entire economy? I'm trying to compare the same boundary, two different metrics, equivalently with economy. So my hypothesis is that this should be less than this. What's going on here in the power metric? As I said, there's no salary, there's no banking, there's no operating economy embedded in this number. It's just how much energy does it take, right? There's a lot of things operating an energy company that are beyond buying the fuel inputs to the process, all kinds of things, right? So this sort of leverage ratio seems like to be off high. When you actually consider money, because money is considering all these other things. So what that means on the graph I'm going to show you on the next slide is that the graph I'm going to show you should be less than 1. According to this hypothesis. And so here it is now, here's 1. The data aren't very long, which is a good comparison. But here's 1. So I showed that basically half or more of the time period that I have is greater than that. A lot of the interesting things that happened in the year before 1980. So you would say, okay, according to this hypothesis, this did not hold. This number is greater than 1. So leverage, money is able to leverage more money in the energy sector than power is able to leverage power production from the energy sector. And so people brought this up in the last discussion as well. Is this possible? Is this a trend that can't continue and so won't? Is this impossible? Is there an energy basis to say that this can't go on forever? Is this a deficit? Are we basically making GDP into something that has no physical basis, and therefore if I'm comparing economic interest of GDP to a physical basis measurement, then maybe I can get something like this ratio where is it information technology? Is there some new technology? Right? Most of the past in thinking about energy technology is better prime movers, higher efficiency turbines, cars, internal combustion engines. Now we have information economy. People say, well, information economy. There's a lot of GDP in information. Google, not Google. Right? This is organizing information in databases on servers. It's just about directly technology. Is this what's going on? So I think there's a good possibility to really the research is, to try to explain this, or at least this is one good research question, to try to explain why this happened and whether it was sort of, in some sense, scientifically impossible, or it's only possible because of debt, or something fundamental about how the economy is now about information. My further hypothesis would be that this number, as I go further to the left, would never be above 1. I don't know that, but I would guess it would never be above 1, and this is probably the only time so it's down to this sort of big threshold. I don't know what the number is here exactly. It might be back above 1 because oil prices are getting pretty low. But I don't know.
So actually,
This is my last one. I just stopped in there for them. Just because I thought it'd be interesting. So, this is this same thing I sort of plotted before, right? How much the energy sector produces in power per year divided by how much power per year the energy sector consumes. So again, there's no economic data embedded in the number. This is a ratio of import, sort of import, net import ratio. So if I'm a negative number on this, I'm a net exporter of energy from my country, above 0 and net importer of energy from my country per year. And so I label people that you recognize as energy exporters, these are oil and gas exporters. And it's sort of interesting thing here. Here's the world average
number here, this means that your energy would be more expensive than